Last week, we learned about the problem of cooperation. And the classic solution to the problem of cooperation is, of course, external enforcement or third-party enforcement. Enforcement of contracts, guaranteeing property rights, punishing defectors or cheaters. In the words of Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, the state. And we will consider under which conditions this is a good solution. We will then ask whether we have essentially just replaced the problem and whether the modern nation state is essentially a protection racket that, like the mafia in The Sopranos, charges us a tax for protection, but it is mostly protection from itself, and how we in some countries have managed to constrain those mobsters, the kings and rulers that run the protection rackets. In the second video, we will take a slightly more optimistic take on the origin of institutions, and we will learn about the tragedy of the commons and what it has to do with those cows here on their beautiful pasture. And in this seminar, we will expand on our knowledge of game theory by learning how to solve games with sequential moves, where I take an action and then you take an action, having observed what I have done. And how to use strategic thinking to predict what happens in these situations. I should also note that some of these slides are based on Clark Golder and Golder's excellent principles of comparative politics. Let's get started. When we discussed the problem of cooperation, we already encountered some solutions. Repeated play and reciprocity, things like the tit-for-tat strategy, but also reputation mechanisms or emotions and altruism. But, of course, some people will not be swayed by those. Some people will seize the opportunity to take advantage of other people. And so this problem of avoiding cheating, of enforcing contracts, stopping the bad behavior, if you want, still looms large and still is a problem. And this is how this defect equilibrium, this bad outcome, the Nash equilibrium, where people are nasty to each other and can't cooperate. This is basically how the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes saw the state of nature, sort of how we existed before the emergence of sort of modern society and the state. Essentially, the law of the jungle. The war of every man against every man is what Hobbes writes. And as a consequence, if we all behave so badly, of course, there's going to be murder and robbery and all sorts of nasty things. And as a consequence, life of man, according to Hobbes and woman, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And maybe this does characterize our hunter-gatherer past, at least if you think about sort of group level dynamics. But I think it helps more to think about this in terms of failed states today. Places where power flows from the rifle, from the holding an AK-47 is what gives you power and rights. Think about 1990s Somalia or Afghanistan. Or we can think of sort of other spaces where there's no clear authority or no law enforcement. Things like the criminal underworld, the world of bank robbery and the mafia, or the dark web. In these niches, there's also no recourse to contracts or courts or law enforcement. If you rob a bank and your sort of partner in crime runs off with the loot, you can't really go to the police and say he stole from me. So this problem exists as sort of the absence of authority totally, like in a failed state, but we can think of also of other areas or subsections of population where this problem, of course, exists. And so we have to think about solutions. And Hobbes' solution, of course, to the state of nature is the emergence of the Leviathan, the authority to keep us all in awe and make sure that we follow the rules. In other words, the state. Empowering this Leviathan, this state, this authority or external enforcer is in a way the idea of a social contract that produces a sovereign power that is strong enough to punish those who steal, those who cheat, those who play defect. In other words, a policeman. Okay. Now, what does the policeman do? Well, the policeman basically doles out punishments if you play defect, if you steal or fail to honor your contracts. And the policeman has to dole out a punishment that is large enough to deter people from choosing the defect option in the first place. So let's enter this punishment into the game. So every time you play defect, either as the first player, the row player, or as the second player, the column player, you are punished. You get maybe the reward from stealing from your neighbor, but you also have to face the punishment P. Is that enough? What I want you to do is I want you to pause the video in a second and then take a piece of paper and maybe try out different values for P. And the question we're asking, of course, is how big does the punishment have to be? How big does P have to be to sustain the corporate kind of equilibrium? So take a piece of paper, take a couple minutes, pause the video, and think about what value of P is sufficient to deter us from committing these crimes, from defect outcome. I'm sure you figured it out. The punishment P has to be larger than 1 in our example. And sort of note that we just switched to sort of cardinal payoffs and real numbers rather than just ordinal payoffs, but it doesn't really matter that much to make this exercise a bit easier. But to think about it more sort of theoretically, basically the punishment has to be large enough and certain enough to occur that basically the advantage of the temptation, the defect, if the other person cooperates, has to, the difference between the temptation value, this defect if the other person cooperates, and the sort of good corporate outcome. This difference between these two payoffs has to be basically covered by the punishment. So we introduced a policeman, an external rule enforcer, or in Hobbes' world, the Leviathan, who punishes those who play foul, and we have to choose a high enough and certain enough kind of punishment. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. Who is going to do it? How do we select the enforcer? And why would this person do us the favor of sort of acting as the policeman? In Shapsley and Boncheck's terms, these issues are costly enforcement, imperfect enforcement, and the enforcer incentives. And the core problem for us, or the next problem for us, of course, is that enforcement is costly. So why would they do us the favor of doing the policing? They have to be paid, the police. So enforcement is costly, therefore we have to sacrifice some of our gains in order to pay this third-party enforcer. In other words, we have to introduce a tax. Let's call it T. So we have introduced a punishment P larger than 1 that is big enough to deter us from defecting. We have introduced a tax T to pay for our policemen. So are we happy? Well, it depends. We can compare the outcomes of our game with external enforcement to the original game, to the original Prisoner's Dilemma or State of Nature game, if you want. Under what condition would we prefer to live? In the one state, the external enforcement world, civil society, if you want, or in the original sort of defect world? We can basically compare the equilibrium in these two games and identify under what conditions we prefer one over the other. In the external enforcement game, of course, the outcome is cooperate, cooperate, and our payoff is 2 minus t. In the original game, the state of nature, the prisoner's dilemma, we end up in the defect outcome, and our payoff is 1. So what does it depend on? Whether we prefer the original state of nature or the situation with external enforcement? Well, it depends on the level of tax. How much do we have to pay the external enforcer in order to provide us with these services? So, in other words, 2 minus t, our payoff from the cooperate equilibrium in the external enforcement situation, has to be larger than 1. Or in other words, t has to be less than 1 for us to prefer the external enforcement situation over the state of nature. In other words, only if the external enforcer, the policeman, the Leviathan, doesn't charge too much tax, it is better than the state of nature game. So, with the particular payoffs that we have chosen, we know that the punishment has to be sufficiently large and the taxation has to be sufficiently small in order for us to actually prefer this situation with the external enforcer. And this is, of course, the big question for the social contract theory people, the theorists. And this depends on a little bit on their backgrounds, maybe. So Hobbes, writing after the English Civil War, and when really chaos had prevailed, sees the state as sort of the only way to solve these grim problems. But other people may come to different conclusions. Citizens empowering the Leviathan, the state, in the world of the social contract theorists, is a really nice idea. So basically, we face a choice between anarchy, which leads us down sort of to the defect equilibrium, payoff of 1, or surrendering the monopoly of violence to the state, and getting sort of protection and enforcement of rules in exchange, and therefore reaping the benefits of cooperation minus some small tax t. So perhaps the cost of policing is 0.5, say. So what does it mean? Well, it means that we basically have these payoffs now. And what we're seeing here is basically what we call a game tree, or in part of a game tree in a sequential form game. Basically a type of game where we make a choice and then maybe someone else makes a choice. But it's just a different way of displaying games that we've encountered before, maybe if there are sequential moves. So in the case of the tax equaling 0.5 for the sort of living in civil society, what does this mean? Well, basically our payoff is the first payoff. First player's payoff is always the first number, and the second player's payoff is the second number. So in this example, the first player is the citizen, all of us, individually, and the second player is perhaps the potential policeman, so to say. And so the first payoff goes to the citizen, second payoff goes to the policeman. And so we basically face a choice here. Do we want to surrender the monopoly of violence to the state and therefore reap the benefits of cooperation minus the tax, so 2 minus t, so we said tax is 0.5, so 1.5, or do we live in anarchy in the state of nature, in the sort of defect outcome, and then the payoff is 1. And obviously 1.5 is better than 1, and therefore we would choose the upper arm here, and end up in the surrendering the monopoly of violence kind of situation. But there is a problem. We have been naive. We have assumed that by surrendering the means of violence to this one person, the external enforcer, the one guy with a gun, we are solving the game between us. We are solving the problem between us. But what is the external enforcer going to do? Is he just going to do us the favor of enforcing the laws, charging us the tax as promised, and act in a good way? What about their incentives? The external enforcer, of course, is a strategic player as well. And a tax rate of 0.5 basically assumed that he is a saint because he has a choice. So if he has a choice, what else can they choose? What if they are not nice? What if they choose something that maximizes their payoff, the tax rate? What if they choose t equals 2? That's not so good anymore. What happens now? So let's assume that the policeman chooses t equal 2. Then what happens to our payoff? Well, they now get 2, much better than 0.5. So obviously they will choose the sort of tax maximizing rate of t, their payoff maximizing rate of tax. What happens to our payoff? Well, our payoff now is 0. We are worse off than in the situation of anarchy, than in the prisoner's dilemma. So we have empowered a policeman to solve the problem between us, but we have just displaced the problem. We have made it worse. We have given a guy with a gun all the power over us, and they can exploit us, and we are actually worse off than in the original sort of state of nature situation. Now, obviously, if we think strategically and think ahead, then we know that, and we would never agree to surrender in the first place. So we would choose the anarchy over surrendering in the knowledge that the policeman will choose t equal 2. And this reasoning is what we call backward induction. And we will look at this in much more detail in the seminar. But what if we don't have a choice? What if we already live in a place where the policeman is already there, and we don't have a choice to go back to this unpoliced situation, Or what if they come to our door? So external enforcement, or the state, may solve the problem we have with each other, but it creates a problem between us and the state, or us and this third-party enforcer, the mafia don, if you want. If we surrender control over violence to the state or to this third-party enforcer, what is going to prevent them from using these means of violence against us and expropriate us, extort us? We have effectively just displaced the problem. We have moved the conflict, the dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma type problem, from the interaction between the citizens to the interaction between the citizens and the state. We have created a monster. And what if we're not allowed to opt out? What if the Leviathan just comes by and doesn't wait for us to empower them? And they just say, we are the rulers now, please give us your money. And in this way, the state looks much more like these guys. Organized crime, the mafia, an enormous legal protection racket that extorts taxes in exchange for protection. Protection from what? Well, mostly from the state itself, or from other states maybe. This insight that the state basically resembles organized crime or a protection racket is what is sometimes also called the predatory view of the state. And it shares the idea that the states are basically organizations that trade security for taxes with the contractarian sort of view of the state. But the key difference is that in the predatory view, the state or other states, perhaps other potential rulers, present the biggest threat to the security of the citizen. And one of the first writers sort of to clarify this insight is Charles Tilley, and his paper on war making, state making, organized crime is on the course Moodle as a sort of further reading. I would very much recommend it. And in this article, this chapter, Tilley basically sort of describes the process of state formation through this lens of organized crime. So where do the states come from in Tilly's sort of world? Well, basically, rulers need to compete with, or have to compete with external rivals. And this creates pressure for rulers to raise money, to extract resources, not only for their own sort of enjoyment, but to make war. And making war is expensive. So the need to extract a lot of revenue basically poses a problem for rulers. So they have to do some things that we now recognize as sort of creating state capacity. They have to eliminate internal rivals, and they need to basically develop state capacity in order to extract resources. And this is the process of state making. So state making is not really the intent of the rulers. It is a byproduct. State formation is the result of the struggle to extract as many resources as possible in order to fight off external rivals. And rulers are just trying to sort of hold on to power. And they essentially create the modern state as sort of a byproduct of this struggle to extract resources, eliminate internal rivals, and fight external rivals, and maybe protect sort of parts of the state that who are their clients. And that's why Tilly says, war makes the state and states make war. Returning to our sort of protection racket type Leviathan, of course, we have to think about how do we stop this? As citizens, we don't want to be exploited. And this is the question of sort of managing the incentives of the third party enforcers, of the rulers, or constraining the Leviathan, if you want. And to that end, we built institutions. We try to create accountability mechanisms, things like voting or ostracism, so getting rid of potential rulers that are more exploitative than others, trying to, through voting, perhaps get rid of the worst types of rulers, if that is sustained, or more generally, sort of things like separation of powers, so fragmenting the power in order to not have one ruler who exploits us, but using checks and balances to constrain the power of this Leviathan. And why would they agree to it? Well, the Leviathan would agree to these power sharing situations either because they are unable to completely control a territory or fight off internal rivals, or because they need to do it in exchange for better extraction or in exchange for money. In the end, as Przewalski says, the state is reliant on capital, on being lent to perhaps by citizens, and therefore they have to accept limits on state predation in exchange for continued availability of resources. And I'll have a couple of readings to recommend on this. I would very much recommend you do some further reading on this topic if you're interested. So the first thing I would recommend is Charles Tilly's piece on war making and state making as organized crime. I, in the end, didn't make this sort of a required reading because you had other things to read, but I would very much recommend having a look at it. It's very brief. These other papers basically touch some of the aspects of the things I've said on the previous slide. So the Northern Weingast paper is basically a discussion of sort of the Glorious Revolution in England, which basically constrained the power of the crown. And it is exactly the argument that I gave before about the king accepting constraints on their power in exchange for a continued sort of reliance on capital, on funding. It's a very sort of classic, important paper. The Falaschetti and Miller piece on constraining Leviathan is basically a sort of more theoretical exposition of some of these problems, warmly recommended as well. And the Olsen piece on dictatorship, democracy, and development is basically a variant on the Tilly argument of how sort of external conflict matters and what types of regimes emerge. So some people may have heard of these sort of roving versus stationary bandits, and this is the paper that sets this out. There's a couple more recommendations though. I think apart from reading Tilly in the original, this is one of the sort of books I would very warmly recommend. The Dictator's Handbook by Bueno de Mesquita and Smith. This basically sets out this logic of sort of what does the ruler do, you know, how do they hold on to power, how do they get to power, how do they hold on to power, in clear detail and nice writing, so it's very accessible for undergraduates. If the book seems too long, I can recommend a YouTube video. I came across this when sort of thinking about this class, and this is excellent. So this is a guy who explains basically the content of the Dictator's or parts of the Dictator's Handbook in sort of a 15-minute video on rules for rulers, and it is excellent. So I would very much recommend it. It is also linked on Moodle. The background for both these and for the Dictator's Handbook by Bueno de Mesquita and Smith is a more serious theoretical book, if you want, The Logic of Political Survival, that sets out the underlying sort of idea, selectorate theory, some of you may have heard, in much more detail with some you know, additional sort of mathematical foundations. So it's very much a game theoretic foundation. So I would very much recommend having a look. If you like the ideas in the Dictator's Handbook or like the sort of rules for rulers video, have a look at The Logic of Political Survival. And the last thing I would recommend, also linked on Moodle, of course, is this article on Dark Leviathan that is basically a nice sort of case study of how all these dynamics that we've just seen, the inability to enforce contracts and get out of the defect equilibrium individually, the need for external enforcement, and what happens if we empower someone in a very niche sort of environment, in the sort of depths of the dark web of the internet, where people you know, buy and sell all sorts of illicit things. But basically all these dynamics play out in a nice and somewhat predictable way. So I would very much recommend this as well. And with these recommendations on this slightly darker sort of predatory view of the state, we end our first video, and maybe look at a slightly more optimistic perspective when we think about the tragedy of the commons.